everyone. Thank you for your patience. I'm the chair of this panel, Invisible Economies, Migration and Labor. My sole role is to say the names of the humans and hopefully to facilitate a little bit. So our first presenters will be Sam Naidu and Andrea Thorpe. Their paper is titled Vulnerability and Complicity, the Figure of a Black Migrant Woman in Miriam Tlali's Devil at the Dead End, and Chimamanda Adichie on Monday of last week. Our second presenter will be Tinika Nuen. That's your second? Okay. Self-Identification as Resistance Strategy Against the Stigmatization of African Diasporic Women, and Analysis of Chika Unigwe's On Black Sister Street. I think third will be Polo Moji. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Third will be Ntokozo, Yingwana. We fit in society by force, sex work, and feminism in Africa. And I believe Polo Moji will be lost due to slight technical problems. The title of her paper is Oceanic Bellies and Liquid Feminism in Fatou Jones' Belly of the Atlantic.
Good.
Thank you, Sarah.
Just to point out that the word consequential actually occurs in our title. It's very important. It's pivotal. So that is something to take note of. Hello, everyone. Andrea and I are members of the Intersecting Diasporas Group, which is also a Melanin-funded research project which I coordinate at the Department of Literary Studies. And this is our second collaboration. For this project, we responded to the theme of the conference by considering how transnational literature gives voice to the figure of the Black female migrant, who is so often muted. The two stories examined in this paper, Miriam Tlali's Devil at a Dead End and Chimamanda Adichie's On Monday of last week, was selected because of the striking similarities. They are actually quite astonishing given how they are separated by time and context and so on. They're also telling differences between these texts, but the portrayal of the Black female migrant who is vulnerable because of, and I quote Patricia Hill Collins, a matrix of domination involving race, gender, poverty, and legal status is what really stands out, this particular focus in both stories. In Tlali's story, domination is examined through critique of the structural and disciplinary systems of apartheid and through interpersonal interactions. Similarly, in Adichie's story, the structural disparity between the economically dominant host country, the USA in this case, and post-colonial Nigeria, as well as the disciplinary systems governing migration, in this story symbolized by the green card, and the interpersonal dynamics between host and migrant are examined. When faced with sexual abuse, exploitation, or manipulation, the protagonists of both stories exhibit a type of complicity in their own violations. This complicity, we argue, is consequent to the vulnerability experienced by the character. Although this is a potentially regressive point politically, and we do concede to that, given the culture of victim blaming which exists in most societies and which shifts responsibility from the perpetrator of sexual violence to the survivor, these stories are in effect potentially radical. So this is our main argument, okay? That they are potentially radical in their representation of the protagonist's recusal agency. So we'd like to begin by providing brief summaries of the stories and hand over to Andrea for that.
So Miriam Tlali's short story, Devil at a Dead End, written in 1978 and published in 1989, describes how an unnamed young black woman is sexually assaulted by a white train guard while traveling alone from Lesotho to Johannesburg. While the young woman is frozen with apparent shock for some length of time, she eventually brings herself to declare to the guard that she has a venereal disease, thus causing him to break off his advances in repulsion. This interaction is ambiguous because of the vulnerable young woman's response to the god, both leading up to the climactic encounter and during the assault itself, which veers between fear and a more complex bodily response. The train, representing both potentially empowering mobility and an unmoored, dangerous space, constitutes a staging ground for Tlali to explore the complex intersections between racial discrimination and sexual violence.
Adichie's On Monday last week opens with a description of a sexual fantasy, which Kamara, a Nigerian migrant to the USA, is having about her African-American employer, Tracy. Kamara has been employed by Tracy's husband, Neil, to care for their 4-year-old son, Josh. Wealthy, middle-class American employers Neil and Tracy are contrasted to poor, disenfranchised Kamara, who, despite having a master's degree in chemistry, is forced to do menial work until she obtains a green card. After 3 months, Tracy, heretofore invisible because she had sequestered herself in her artist's studio in the basement, emerges. The initial meeting between Tracy and Kamara is a catalyst, which propels Kamara into a new form of dislocation and belonging. From being the unfulfilled wife of Tabechi and the recently arrived Nigerian migrant, she is transformed into a sensual woman with sexual desire and aspirations to change her body and her current life circumstances. Rather than resist the sexual manipulation to which Tracy subjects her, she is complicit. And the story ends with Kamara realizing that she has been duped, not only by Tracy, but by Tabechi, the American dream, and most significantly, by her own inadvertent desires. We now move on to examining the concept of vulnerability.
Black female migrants are vulnerable for a variety of intersectional reasons. They are frequently displaced, disoriented, poor, without resources, susceptible to racism and xenophobia, and prey to sexual predators. In these two stories, the black female migrant is portrayed as vulnerable because of race, gender, poverty, and legal status. One is black during apartheid, and one is a recently arrived black African in the USA. Due to their vulnerability, they are violated, albeit in very different ways. In Devil at a Dead End, Tlali describes how the girl's mobility is impeded and her safety is threatened as she makes her long journey from Lesotho to South Africa. She is marked as an object of attention when she has to ask a guard to change her ticket while on the train because a racist booking clerk has refused to help her. The guard thus notices her and assures that she is placed in a compartment by herself. She initially thwarts his plan of isolating her by joining an older woman in another compartment. The older woman explains the guard's plan to the girl, but the girl casts doubt on the guard's intention because, quote, somehow they don't seem to know that we are human beings like them. The older woman responds by pointing to a nearby army camp, saying, no black woman moves in that area without men to protect her. They chase them into the dongas and grab them by force. Would they do that if they didn't think we're humans? This exchange both foregrounds the vulnerability of black women, particularly when traveling, moving, and attests to the contorted social relations of apartheid, where rape is presented horrifically as evidence of white South African men viewing black women as human. After the older woman disembarks, the guard forces open the girl's locked compartment and sexually assaults her, attempting to rape her. Throughout this encounter, Tlali reminds the reader of the shared domain of power of the white male characters. This effect is achieved by frequently re-invoking the gaze of the booking clerk. Tlali's emphasis on the nexus of racism and objectification within which the assault takes place encourages us to read the woman's ambivalent and complicit response as consequent to her vulnerability as a black female migrant in apartheid South Africa.
Similarly, On Monday last week, the vulnerable Kamara is subjected to the dominating and violating gaze of her employer, Tracy. From the outset, Kamara's precarious migrant status is described. It's described in some detail. And with each reference to this liminal status, Adichie uncovers an additional layer of vulnerability. First, economic desperation and then boredom result in her wanting, I quote, the job, any job. She wanted a reason to leave the apartment every day. Then her form of employment results in a denuding of agency and dignity. Kamara's intimate labour, and I use Shireen Ali's term, as a childminder and domestic worker, renders her even more fractured and vulnerable. Furthermore, after 6 years apart, she is estranged from her husband, and this also heightens her vulnerability. The result is that Kamara is filled with feelings of, I quote, flatness and dismay. In this story, just as the potent structures of apartheid inform the interpersonal encounter in Tlali's story, the host-migrant power dynamics of the USA shape and colour the interaction between Kamara and her employer. We're going to move on now to provide just a little bit of theoretical underpinning for our definition of consequential complicity.
The concept of complicity has been theorized beyond being an accomplice to a crime to embrace the term's etymology as a folded togetherness, as Mark Sanders proposes. What Deborati Sunhill finds useful in the concept of complicity is its potential to provide, to quote, a nuanced understanding of how power folds us into its mechanisms, or the institutional forces that mediate our agency. We also consider here Sarah Nuttall's concept of entanglement, defined as, quote, a condition of being twisted together or entangled or entwined, involved with. It speaks of an intimacy gained, even if it was resisted or ignored or uninvited. Judith Butler's theory of passionate attachment also helps to explain how complicity operates in terms of power relations. Butler claims that dependency can result in passionate attachment to one's subordination, and that, quote, the one who holds out the promise of continued existence plays to the desire to survive. In both stories, the characters exhibit a momentary identification and attachment with their violators, but both characters are imbued with a strong instinct to survive both their specific experiences and their general conditions. The ambivalence with which the characters respond to their status as migrants and their sexual violation is best described in terms of abjection. Kristeva's formulation of the abject is helpful here in unpacking contradictory responses experienced by the black female migrant. Using psychoanalysis, Kristeva describes how abjection points to a defining and protective border between self and an other which is threatening to the self. Adult simultaneous responses of attraction and repulsion, like the responses to the sexual violation and predation experienced by the protagonists of the stories, can be explained in terms of this primal experience.
So, informed by the concepts of complicity, entanglement, passionate attachment, and the abject, we have therefore coined the phrase consequential complicity to describe the ambivalent relationship between the structural and the impersonal, and between violator and the violated. Consequential complicity, as evidenced in these stories, describes the causal relationship between vulnerability and complicity. Complicity stems from vulnerability and is both a necessary strategy of survival and a generative state of potential transgression within an oppressive context. Because of the folded togetherness of the black female migrant characters with those who hold power over them, these protagonists are, however fleetingly and in response to their vulnerability, complicit in their own objectification and violation, as desiring and desired subjects intent upon survival.
So in Devil at a Dead End, we see this complex coexistence of threat, repulsion, and desire in the young woman's response to the guard's assault. When the guard leaves temporarily to announce the next station, she remains frozen in the compartment, trembling and feeling guilty. She reprimands herself because she should be screaming for help or something instead of sitting waiting. However, Tlali writes that she had been like a bewildered beholder, powerless. She was taken back at what seemed to be a response by a part of herself over which she had no control. She felt like a being apart, looking on. There is an ambivalent coexistence here of agency and powerlessness. Most significantly, the girl is at the mercy of her own bodily response to the assault. There is a suggestion that she experiences involuntary desire or arousal. Her complicity can be read as coexisting ambivalently with her desire for agency and survival, a notion which is upheld by the story's conclusion, in which the woman finds an ingenious way of eventually voicing her non-consent. Also notable is Tlali's use of language, which is sensual and mostly free of descriptions of violence or force, but frequently deploys a tone associated with a romantic or erotic narrative, including the repetition of the word tender or tenderly. Eventually, it appears to be shame which leads the woman to express her non-consent. Tlali writes that the girl's conscience, her soul, stood aloof, untouched, admonishing, her heart pounding fast, but only with a feeling of guilt. She waits for some invisible, omnipotent power to come to the aid of the helpless, the weak, the defenseless, which highlights her vulnerability, even as she blames herself for not resisting the encounter and experiences guilt. She then decides on a plan of action. She declares in situ that she has a venereal disease. This incantation is a way of speaking her non-consent, an inventive way of eluding rape. Her sigh of relief as the guard disappears signals that she is free of the threat of rape, yet her reaction throughout the encounter implies a more ambivalent response.
On Monday of last week, Kamara is complicit in her seduction by the mother of the child who she minds. Initially, she feels strongly attracted to Tracy. Just as she was duped into believing in the American dream, Kamara is vulnerable as migrant and employee and desperately seeks affirmation as her sense of self dissolves in this alien national and domestic space. It is not surprising, given her investment in notions of a better life and self in the USA, that she is complicit in the intricate invasions to which Tracy, an embodiment of that better life and self, subjects her. But when she realizes that Tracy does not actually desire her, and that this is her habitual behavior, to control people through flattery, she realizes her own naivety and complicity. Arguably, this consequent complicity is the start of Kamara's process of self-definition in the diaspora space, rather than a consolidation of her status as disempowered, dislocated migrant. From the outset, Kamara reacts strongly to being seen by Tracy, even though Tracy is obviously objectifying her and toying with her for her own mysterious ends. In doing so, she buys into dominant images of the female body, imagining, I quote, Tracy caressing her stomach flat as the book cover. Through being objectified by Tracy, Kamara begins to desire a different self, one which she thinks Tracy will desire in return. As problematic as this desire may seem, it contains also a seed of hope for the otherwise disenfranchised Kamara, what Adichie calls in the story, I quote, a flowering of extravagant hope. When Tracy looks at her, she's conferred a new, unfamiliar status as a sexual being, one who is desired and who desires. In one last intimate encounter, highly charged with sexual tension, Tracy reinforces her power over Kamara by turning the interrogative, "Would you take your clothes off for me?" into the imperative, "You will take your clothes off for me." Kamara becomes consumed with the desire to strip for Tracy and exhibits a thrilling and liberating lack of concern for the strictures which had heretofore defined her life. But in their next encounter, Tracy is markedly detached towards Kamara, and instead focuses her attention on Josh's French teacher, Miriam. Kamara's disappointment and realization are captured through her averted gaze, and in the final scene of the story, Kamara, who's been on a diet in order to appear more appealing to Tracy, reaches forward and eats a cookie. And this is typical of the short story, that very compacted conclusion. Okay? This final act is a repudiation of the self that desired to be desired by Tracy, and it is defiant enough to suggest that Kamara's newfound transgressive agency is only in its infancy.
In both these stories, the black female migrants, in conclusion, experience a dissonance between experiencing pleasure associated with being an object of desire and a realization of their exploitation by their abuser. Zoe Wickham writes that Devil at a Dead End could be read in terms of jouissance in conflict with the phallic law, which is linguistically resolved by a woman's ingenious claim to be afflicted with venereal disease. Indeed, in conflict with the phallic law in both stories is jouissance, that is, sexual pleasure, a desire for transcendence, and a desire to be desired. Wickham argues that in Tlali's case, this dilemma is resolved through the woman's utterance. The mute speaks into being her own survival. In On Monday last week, Kamara's wry realization that she has been abused and violated is also a partial, potentially empowering resolution of the conflict between phallic law and jouissance, which leaves her with an uncertain future in the United States. Finally, one way in which consequential complicity is potentially empowering is through the capacity for transgression that it signals. For instance, by both contravening the norms of heterosexual desire and fantasizing about committing adultery, Kamara subverts traditional Nigerian norms of gender to which she has been subject her whole life. Similarly, in Devil at a Dead End, the description of intimate encounter hints at a subversive humanizing of relationships between black and white South Africans within the apartheid context. The vulnerability of the black female migrants in both stories frames the consequential complicities in which they are entangled, which in turn opens up spaces for transgression, allowing them a provisional degree of agency within limiting sexist and racist frameworks of desire and objectification. In these two stories, Tlali and Adichie imagine how black migrant women act within the straitening conditions of their vulnerability in order to exercise self-definition and seize what Patricia Hill Collins calls the power to name their own reality.
Okay, hi everyone, my name is Yingwana. I am a researcher and a PhD student at the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of Witwatersrand. And I wouldn't be a very good feminist scholar if I didn't first disclose my positionality. So I self-identify as a scholar activist, which basically means that my scholarly work is informed and driven by my activism, and in return then my activism kind of like helps improve, my activism informs my scholarly work, and then my scholarly work then helps to improve my activism. It also gets confusing for me sometimes. Okay. So this is just a brief overview. I might go quite briskly through some of the sections, but I'll start off by giving a bit of background and context in terms of the sex work landscape in South Africa specifically, although the study was also with other African countries, and some literature review as per usual, and I'll kind of like skim through some of the theoretical and conceptual frameworks that guided my thinking. But I'll try to get to the findings, which will hopefully be more interesting. Okay, and in terms of the background, just briefly, sex work can simply be understood as any form of exchange of sexual services for money or anything of monetary value. But if we were to go for an internationally recognized kind of definition, we might go with the UNAIDS one, which defines sex work as any agreement between two or more persons in which the object is exclusively limited to the sexual act and ends with that, and which involves preliminary negotiations for price. Now, in South Africa, sex work is fully criminalized, meaning that the buyer, the client, the seller, the sex worker, and anyone living off the earnings of a sex worker is considered a criminal. So those will be your pimps, your brothel owners. And if you kind of like push this law, you might as well also be criminalizing the dependents of sex workers. And the law itself stems from 1957, and it's a remnant of the Morality Act of 1927, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, which sought to police who has sex with who across racial lines. But interesting enough, until 2007, it was only the sex worker who was criminalized. Actually, the client was not explicitly criminalized, but in 2002 there was the Jordan versus the State Constitutional Court judgment, which influenced the amendment in 2007, which resulted in the client also being criminalized. I won't go into too much into that case. So what happened is that in 1999, the South African Law Reform Commission was mandated to look into a different legal model, or at least the available legal models that govern sex work, which are criminalization, decriminalization, which sees sex work as any other form of work, partial criminalization, which only criminalizes the client, and legalization, which, if you just think of Amsterdam's red light districts, where you're allowed to sell sex, but in certain specific designated areas, so it's that kind of vibe. So the Commission embarked on this Sexual Offences Act, Adult Prostitution Law Reform Project. Although their report was actually finalized in 2015, it was only released in 2017 with the recommendation to keep criminalization or consider partial criminalization with some rehabilitation kind of strategies. And in terms of the context, actually, before I move on to the context, I think it's very important for me to stress and be clear that when I'm talking about sex work or sex workers, I'm talking about adult consenting sex workers, people who actually do sex work to make a living. I distinguish from transactional sex, which might be in the form of your blesser-blessee relationships, where it's the exchange of gifts for sexual favors and whatnot. So when I'm talking about sex work and sex, I'm talking about people who actually see this as a form of work. Okay, and then in terms of the context, so with a population of 5 million and an employment rate of 27.7%, we find that, sorry, I'm just getting that question. Okay, on the outside there. So with an employment rate of about 27.7%, and with it being most notable among black women at like 49.1%, then it's really not that surprising, it shouldn't come as a surprise that we find that the majority of sex workers in South Africa, at least, are black women. According to a 2013 sex worker population size estimate study, there are approximately 153,000 sex workers in the country, of which about 6,000 are transgender females, 7,000 about males, and 138,000 females. That's about 0.9% of the country's female population, and most of whom are actually black and around 70% street-based. And in addition, sex workers with a primary school education are able to earn nearly 6 times more than the typical income from formal work, such as domestic work. And on average, female sex workers support around 4 dependents, with their male colleagues supporting around 2. Okay, I'll note that's just the cover of the size estimate study and some of the graphics which go along with the statistics that I just laid out. Okay, and then in terms of the study, very quickly. So this study actually was in 2 parts. First, it was in 2014 as part of my honors research project at UCT. And then I did a follow-up of that study when I was doing my master's in 2015. And basically I was asking the question, what does it mean to be an African sex worker feminist? And in that, I was exploring the embodiment of the 3 identities of being an African, a sex worker, and feminist, and the intersectionalities of the social dimensions that come into play, such as race, class, and gender, but specifically within the African context. With both studies, the deduction was that even though these 3 identities are often considered incongruent, in certain embodiments, they actually inform each other. And why did I embark on this kind of study? With the hope of inspiring conceptualization or a strand of African feminism that speaks most honestly to the nuances and complexities of selling sex in Africa. And actually, this study came about while I was working at SWET, the Sex Worker Education and Advocacy Task Force. This is where I do my whole activism part. And that's why I'm wearing this t-shirt. So SWET is an NGO that advocates for the rights of adult consenting sex workers. And at the time, I was the advocacy officer. And we would go and engage with policymakers, other activists, other members of civil society, and feminists or women's groups. And what we found is that whenever we would try and engage in feminist spaces, there was a bit of an antagonism. There was this whole like, oh, well, no, actually, you're the one that needs to be rescued here. There wasn't that acknowledgement that we can be actually fellow feminists. And this is actually illustrated through one of the respondents' quote. What confused me is that when everyone introduced themselves as feminists and we introduced ourselves as sex workers, they were not happy. Not like, you know, when people are happy, they're like, oh, wow, sex workers are feminists. And then the topic continues. But it was like ignorance. And at that time, I hadn't learned how to stand up for myself and say, yes, we are feminists. So when we realized that actually we're not getting anywhere with these feminist spaces, we decided, okay, perhaps we should take some time out and reevaluate for ourselves then, what does it mean to be a sex worker in Africa who self-identifies as feminist? So this is where the idea for the study came about, and that's why it's actually a feminist participation action research kind of study, because it was informed by the participants themselves. Okay, very briskly, the type of literature that kind of got me thinking about this work is by Joe DeZima, Jill Nagel. I think in the next slide you'll see their cover, which is Horse and Other Feminists, and Sylvia Tamali's work with Ugandan sex workers, and more recently, Chimamanda, sex worker rights activism in Africa. So what I really found quite interesting was with Tamali's work with sex workers in Uganda, because what she notices there is that there's always this assumption that in the exchange of in the transaction between a client and a sex worker, the client has the power and the sex worker is disempowered. But what Tamali observed is that there's actually a constant exchange of power. So when the client approaches the sex worker, perhaps waiting on the side of the road, they have the monetary power. And the sex worker has the sexual power, which the client wants. And there's this negotiation of the price and which services and whatnot. And then there's this toggle of power. And then once we've decided, okay, for this much I'm willing to do this, then we do the transaction, and then there's exchange of the power. The client leaves with the sexual power, satisfaction, sort of, and the sex worker leaves with part of the client's monetary power. So for me that was quite interesting because it kind of like debunked this whole thing like sex workers are disempowered and whatnot. Okay, I'm gonna jump. This is just the main research questions and the kind of sub-themes that kind of informed it. I'm gonna skip because I'm running out of time. And the group that I worked with, Awake, Women of Africa, so that's what we named the group, was made up of members of Sisonke, which is the sex worker movement, the national sex worker movement in South Africa. The group itself was made up of black and colored members because that tends to be the kind of demographic that Sweat attracts, being based in Cape Town. And they're between the ages of 25 and 48, including transgender female sex workers. It was quite also interesting for me to observe how your cis female kind of sex workers were able to accept and appreciate their transgender sisters and how they explain that in their feminism. And just briefly there, once we started, so what we would meet like once every second week, funding permitting, and we would go through some of my readings because at the time I was doing my honors there. And so we would go through like waves of feminism, what does gender mean and whatnot. And we would try to unpack that for ourselves. And we would have meetings with Gallagher Clark as well, who's at the African Gender Institute, to try and understand these things better. And as our confidence grew, we would also meet with visiting scholars. So here you see a Awake meeting with Chandra Mohanty, who wrote Under Western Eyes. And again, we're trying to school ourselves rather than being told what it means to be a sex worker, feminist. Okay, so at this, wow, all right, I'm start ignoring it now. So what Mohanty had asked the group at first was like, okay, why do you call yourself feminist? How do you self-identify as feminist? And then one of the participants was like, I will never allow patriarchy to work on me, since we are different people with different cultures. We know that most of us black people will believe that we should obey the man because the man is the one with the power, you know? So everything must come by man. But since for me, being a sex worker, I've seen that I'm more than a man. I can do what a man can do because I've been studying through my sex work money. My child is old enough with my sex work money. So I was like, okay then, I'm a feminist. So already from the onset, there was this understanding, wait, the issues of patriarchy, the issues of culture, there's something about being black and power that kind of informs the understanding of being feminist. So in this study, I tried to unpack some of that. And this was of the second group, the African Sex Worker Alliance. Like I said, I tested out the findings from the first study in my master's, where I worked with members of the African Sex Worker Alliance from 7 countries, which are listed there. And this time around, I thought, let me challenge myself, let me mix it up, and actually also invite male sex workers into the space. So I made the call quite broad. It was just like, if you identify or feel that you're an African sex worker feminist, come through. And, okay, I'm going to skip some of this theoretical stuff. And this is basically what I was trying to do. I was trying to deal with the issue that you have in feminist scholarship when it comes to the sex work discourse, very polarizing positions. You either have your abolitionist or your anti-sex work feminist who see sex work as intrinsically exploitative, specifically to women. And then you have your sex positive feminists, like who propagate the happy hooker discourse. And what I was interested in is the space in between, because the participants were pretty much saying, okay, fair enough. We appreciate the fact that through sex work, we're able to provide for our families. Through sex work, we're able to feel more sexually liberated because we can actually tell a man, this is what I'm willing to do for this much. But then again, we also want to be able to express the human rights violations that we're experiencing in this line of work. And so it was difficult for sex worker feminists to kind of like go with these. So this is the space I was exploring, and also that also illustrates what I was going for. Okay, I think my time is running out. So, wrapping it up. I'm not going to go too much through the methodology section, but this was the body maps that came out of the workshop with the ASWA members. I pretty much asked them to, on a body outline, to illustrate how would being an African manifest on this body map, and then the second layer, how would being a sex worker manifest, And the third layer, how would being a feminist manifest. And I use those as prompts for the semi-structured interviews afterwards in the focus group. Okay, right, wrapping it up, I promise. So, in terms of being an African sex worker feminist, some of the themes that came up were around the politics of the law, race, class, and African cultures. Yeah. So, Lolita describes, because most of the time I was abused by the white apartheid government as a black man, I have been sent to jails. I have been denied the chances to work because of the criminal records I had from my sex working. So that is why, because I did not think that a white woman was going to be under those circumstances. That is why I stick to the South African black feminist. Okay. And interesting enough with Frida, she draws on her Xhosa culture, saying, I remember when I was a virgin, we used to go fetch water from the river. And if you were a maiden at the time, you walked around bare-breasted and just wore a cloth here at the bottom. But if it so happened that you broke the law and had sex with a boy, you would walk around naked with a spear. And then the mothers would go and ask for damages money. Their rights for the boy's house. Oh, their rights from the boy's house, sorry. So what money is it that they were asking for? So when I asked her, so what do you think this money was for? She was like, well, clearly it shows that there has been some kind of monetary value placed on a woman's sex or a girl's sex. So why is it an issue now that I want to cash in on it and not my mothers and aunts? And the same kind of argument, interestingly enough, came up with the lobolas. It was like, why is it an issue that I want to cash in and not my uncles? So it was quite interesting for me how some of the participants are able to draw from the African practices or cultures to actually affirm why they don't see an issue with selling sex. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Life experiences that account for sex workers feminism. Some of the things that came out of there was around the empowering knowledge and economic survival and independence and sexual autonomy, pleasure and liberation. As Zoe puts it, I think it's, I say it's liberation. You have a sexual identity. You can move around, you can maneuver your way through spaces and platforms that were not really open before. And
two more people.
Two more,
wrap
okay.
up conclusion.
This is the, okay, I'll skip. Conclusion. So what does it mean to be an African sex worker feminist? It's about challenging traditional African notions of sex, gender, and sexuality. It's about managing the tensions between pro and anti-sex work extremists. It's about carrying the burden of colonial legacies of racial discrimination and sexual oppression. It's about engaging in activism and movement building. Struggling to be recognized as a worker while providing for a family, and striving to gain respect from society because the law labels you a criminal. And most importantly, I feel is that it's about finding a language of feminism that speaks most honestly to the nuances and complexities of sex in Africa. I'm so sorry, Chair.
Technological help?
No, I'm just playing with some
A light.
There we go.
Please do.
Many 21st century writers have presented nuances to African diasporic experiences. Authors such as Self-Identifies, Chika, Yingwana, and Chimamanda Adichie have focused on the female perspective and its position in the global world. Subsequently, they have carried on the tradition of Moji and Cheta, and Ntokozo. Each of these writers engage with the social conditions of women in the diaspora. Specifically, I look at Chika and Yingwana's novel On Black Sister Street that examines the experiences of African sex workers in Untitled. Her book structures around 4 female protagonists who narrate the tragic events that lead to their present social circumstances. Sissy is a university graduate who is unable to enter the job market. Because of this financial frustration, she then leaves Nigeria in the hopes to attain financial prosperity. Unfortunately, her aspirations never materialize as she is murdered for not paying her monthly installments to a pimp, Senegal deadline. However, her tragic ending becomes the catalyst for the other three women to reopen their past wounds. Efa falls pregnant at the age of 16 but is unable to provide for her son, and thus she goes abroad to support him as well as her two siblings. In contrast to being economically motivated, Alma desires an escape from her monotonous life and job at her aunt's cafeteria. Her independent and fiery nature suppresses her childhood trauma of being raped by her stepfather. Similarly, Joyce suffered rape and loss of her family at the hands of the Janjaweed militant during Sudan's Second Civil War. Her coming to Belgium story is different compared to the other three women, because they chose to list themselves as sex workers, where she was under the impression of working as a nanny. Although the characters are diverse in their backgrounds, appearances, and motivations, they all experience social hardships of being a sex worker. Ngui draws inspiration from her own cultural shock in witnessing the Red Window displays in Unfab after her immigration from Nigeria to Belgium. The city district houses a large population of Nigerian prostitutes. During her interview with Diome, she felt that a story was waiting to be written, waiting to be attended to, but a story that needed to be explored, and the only way was to write about it. The novel is a blend of fiction and facts as the author researched and conducted interviews with sex workers in the area. The controversial subject exposes the sex industry's darkness, yet it humanizes those who work in the business. Scholars have analyzed the book through two approaches. The first approach looks at how Lagos and Antwerp shaped the four females' identities and their self-worth. Specifically, scholars such as Tinika Nuen and Cullen are focused on the experience of migration and globalization in relation to human trafficking. The second approach examines the woman's social relationships and struggles against patriarchy. Each character sacrifices her body to better her socio-economic status and circumstances, either for herself or loved ones. According to scholars Demal, Eza, and Chikundri. Although both approaches provide substantial groundwork that covers and takes themes of patriarchy, sexual violence, migration, identity, agency, and socio-economic struggles, I notice a lack of scholarship on the characters' intended responses towards the sex worker stigma. This paper evaluates instances where the protagonists submit and challenge their prostitute identity. I argue that they operate in a paradoxical role, where they are both complicit and resistant to the overly sexualized black female body. African women who are sex workers suffer from a double stigma of being a prostitute as well as being ostracized for their racial difference. In addition to the novel attention to the issue of stigmatization, it demonstrates that the woman's internalization of it damages their self-worth. Thus, the examiner sees where clients and other women stigmatize the protagonist, and they examine their self-identification as a coping mechanism against their profession. So Joyce's cousin Etienne appropriates her racial identity to suit his colonial sexual fantasy. She submits to his wishes of being his Nubian princess, as well as removes her makeup to accentuate her natural African beauty for their sessions together. His colonial exoticism reduces Joyce to her physical features that, according to Della the Pimp, is in great demand by white men because they are tired of their woman and wanting a bit of colour and spice. Although she does not overtly reject his imposed fantasy, she does try to minimize their session and show her disdain of him when other characters joke about his strange appearance. Her small resistant acts do not jeopardize her job, but reveals her awareness of her client's treatment of her. In contrast to Joyce's response, Sissy remains silent and attempts to detach herself from her sexual engagements. The ominous narrative provides a similar situation where Sissy's body becomes exoticized, as one of her clients explained that Africans are good at satisfying sexual urges and desires. His compliment stigmatizes her to be a sexual demon or other. After their intercourse, he attempts to initiate conversation with her, but she refuses to interact on a personal level because such a gesture would change the encounter to something normal and nonchalant, which then discounts her feelings of humiliation and discomfort. Her experience of being racially sexualized underpins a sexual perversity, enjoyment and curiosity that establish an unequal power relationship. Ngui provides another power relation in addition to men objectifying women, which is between African women who either share or differ in social class. I observe that her intersectional approach blurs a simple distinction of us versus them formulated on a social, cultural, or gender commonality. Subsequently, she illustrates that females are both victims and perpetrators who pass judgment on each other. Before Efa became a prostitute, already at a young age, she was already selecting sex for money to sustain her family. She becomes pregnant and visits Titus, the local hair bead merchant, at his house and requests financial responsibility for his son. But unfortunately, his wife insults and stigmatizes Efa as one of those girls who seduce middle-aged men for their wealth. She calls Efa a useless girl, whore, idiot, and dumb. Furthermore, she brings the protagonist's character into question. A small girl like you, what were you doing with a man? And your age, what were you doing straighter or late for a man? Which girl from a good home comes around sleeping with a man who's old enough to be her father? The wife implies that F is not a well-brought-up girl and she lacks moral behavior and social conduct. She's able to defame the protagonist because of her higher socio-economic position, and thus alters the story to blame the protagonist rather than her husband, even though she knows that he has a wandering eye. Her reaction indicates that she sees Effa as a disruptive figure that can ruin her own comfortable lifestyle and family image. A similar situation occurs with Alma and her mother, where she instigates a collapse of their nuclear family structure. When brother Cyril, Alma's stepfather, accuses her of failing her university entrance exam because she's lazy, she rebels against him and exposes his sexual crimes of raping her to her mother. Upon hearing that, she does not side with Alma, but it invalidates her traumatic experience and calls her a wicked child whose sole aim is to ruin her. Her denial of the truth arises from the same fear as Titus's wife. Both women are not willing to sacrifice their socio-economic status despite their complicity in perpetuating sexual violence. The stigmatization of other females occurs when one threatens or compromises another socio-economic position. If and Alma represent a danger to the livelihoods of Titus's wife and Alma's mother, even though the main characters are of a low social rank, their sexual act collapses the family structure. In addition to the tension between women of different social statuses, the book provides evidence that stigmatization happens when others transcend their socio-economic class. The narrative recounts the story of a Ghanaian prostitute called Plain, who had a rich footballer fall in love with her, and as a result he paid off her pimp, married her, and installed her in his villa outside of Brussels. Upon hearing her story, other African sex workers stigmatized her out of jealousy for her rise up the social ladder and further accused her of being touch and follow Juju to help cash and hold onto him. One of them discounts the possibility that the man fell for her physical features or her personality. Their skepticism towards this anomaly invites their curiosity on how else could she have managed to cook such a big fish to completely transform her life to one of infinite power. Such questions imply that sex workers possess an allure that allows them to be strategic and gain monetary benefits from their customers. Ngui complicates any power that the protagonists gain, as a sex worker role interferes with their normal lives. The entanglement of the human self with the sex worker self produces fractured multiple self-identities. In other words, the prostitute role permeates into every sense of their selves, but they are unable to extract their normal self outside the profession. Such an identity crisis deeply affects any form of self-identification. Although this concept suggests an assertion of agency in a reclaimed space, it also implies that a self-reinvention involves destruction. Consequently, I argue that self-identification comes at the cost of sacrificing parts of the self, which ironically helps each protagonist to take accountability and responsibility for her decisions and actions. Sissy changes her name from Chisholm to Sissy when she accepts Della's offer to become one of his working girls in Belgium, which marks her acceptance and transition to a new life that is both her own choosing but not her preferred career. Her identity as Sissy takes on her responsibility for her decision to become a prostitute. Most importantly, her newborn self-identity preserves and prevents her old identity from being tainted with the present circumstances. Chisholm becomes her shade, her unconscious, her past self that is hidden and suppressed. These two self-identifications are intimately connected because she subconsciously resurfaces the other as a coping mechanism to help her live out her reality. She identifies as Sissy to counsel memories of her Lago's life, but when she has a bad day at work, she has a chair in her room where she sits to remind herself that her real name is Chisholm. Identity becomes a burden that she escapes temporarily from through her shopping spree. She dresses and plays out different characters such as the tourist, the rich housewife, or the solo traveler. Her make-believe dress-up games offers her control yet fluidity over her identity, which paradoxically allows her to remain anonymous so she can be anyone from anywhere. Shopping gives her the opportunity to change her backstory in accordance to the bought item. For example, she buys baby socks and tells the saleswoman that she's expecting her first child. Material items bring her comfort, an escape from her profession, and negative thoughts about herself. She lives out these superficial roles without carrying the burden of their responsibilities. In addition, her spending sprees remind her that once she hits a big, that she can reincarnate herself as Chisholm. The character sees material power as a tool that can provide her past self with a legitimate social economic position, as well as erase her experiences of being Sissy. If is another character who sees material power's potential to transform an individual, but in contrast to Sissy's attempt to revive Chisholm, she uses it to climb up the working ranks and finally become a madam. The narrative informs the reader that Effa saves enough money to repay Della, as well as buy two girls to help start up her own brothel in Belgium. Her future outlines that her prostitute identity becomes a means to an end. In other words, her work experience helps her learn and understand the industry that ultimately leads to her economic success and establishment. She gains agency through a complicit investment in the sex business. I observed that the novel exploration of the connection between women, agency, self-identification, and the sex industry reflects a pertinent contemporary issue. Although human trafficking is significantly increasing, some females who are in the industry illegally or legally challenge the sex worker stigma. They embrace, assert, and or appropriate their profession. The Huffington Post article Stigmatization of Sex Work to be Blessed and Slain, Tlali writes about the growing social media trend of South African prostitutes posting images of their material benefits received from endangering their job under the tagline Blessed Lifestyle. Contrary to feeling ashamed or undignified, these women use commodities to validate their social position and power. Interestingly, they do not claim the titles prostitute or sex worker, but rebrand themselves as slave queens, since the latter has connotations of expenses paid overseas travel, fancy cars, expensive dining, and clothing items. Despite their perceived boost to their social class status, they are still trapped in the socio-economic transaction where sexual favors are exchanged for material benefits. Lesser lifestyles enforce an unequal power dynamic as patron and worker. The desire for social material power has created a new faction in the industry called financial domination. Women who call themselves dominatrix set up payment plans for their clients in which the latter buys gifts and pays for the former's living expenses. Although this relationship appears similar to the blessed lifestyle, financial domination is a perverse involvement of the sex industry, since these women do not perform any sexual favors but control and degrade their patrons. This fetish lifestyle places the woman in power as these dominatrix call their men derogatory terms such as pay pigs, money slaves, and finish fun. Although another difference is that their psychological power gains occur with a computer, which then removes the physical aspect of sexual interaction. Instead, they dictate their clients' actions and behavior. According to one of Washington's interviewed dominatrix, she sees financial domination as a feminist act that subverts patriarchal power. Wealth redistribution becomes a rebalance between those who are empowered and who are disempowered. Okay, I'm ending now. So, On Black Sister Street contributes towards these ongoing conversations with a focus on African women who migrate from their African country and endure the psychological effect of being a sex worker in a Western country. Each character's encounter with the stigma reveals a complex relationship with material items, socioeconomic power, identity, and gender politics. Despite their various resistances and coping mechanisms, the book demonstrates that their agency is forced them to sacrifice parts of themselves, as well as commit them as neither perpetrator nor victim, innocent nor complicit. Their choices and decisions bring about their destruction as well as their enlightenment. Okay.
I can't speak talk, so I'm not going to try. And what I'm going to do is, while we're trying to set up my technology, I'm going to change the order of my presentation, because otherwise I just won't get through it, okay? So, that way, so let me start, first of all, by talking about my title. Oceanic, Bellies, and Liquid Feminism in Fatou Diome's Belly of the Atlantic. Now, just for today, because this is a part of a larger project, I'm just going to ask the question, who is Fatou? Who's Fatou? And my consideration of this representation of Fatou, who's also the author, is through the analytical lens of Afro-Europeanism. Now, this is a project that I've been working on for a while. And looking at the hyphenated term, or even not hyphenated, Afro-European, is a claim around African origin and belonging in European territory. Now, the emphasis on belonging is reflected by Sabrina Brancanto's assertion that Afropean literature, in Afropean literatures, the migrant does not appear or exist or appears very briefly as a migrant. Those that are, that is, those that explicitly describe the migratory experience show a sense of belonging that is immediate and always manifold. Casting the margins, marginalization and alienation, as a productive space from which to have a deeper insider knowledge than indigenous citizens. Brancanto thinks of this as revealing a sort of transculturality of Europe. Now there's something that I find problematic here, the question of indigenous versus migrant, right? when we know that European identities in themselves are not homogeneous. If you look at France, you've got the Basque, you've got the Bretagne, you've got all sorts of Breton, etc. So this flattening of cultural and linguistic identities then creates or constructs this discourse of integration, right? And integration that is something that has to be invented or introduced with the migration of ethnic minorities. So while I do concur with Brancanto, she wrote an article called Afro-European Identities, a New Discursive Category, ? Right? And she was trying to problematize whether or not it's worth investigating or even thinking through this as a category. Is it okay? All right, thanks. I'm starting to get worried. All right. Anyway, so what Brancanto is saying here is that Afro-European literature exposes what is called the silent racializations that construct Europe, right? A sort of amnesia, or willful amnesia. And in this paper, I will associate those silent racializations with a paper written by an ex-colleague of mine, Raimi Gabdamosi. And he writes a critique of the Afro-European subject as the eternal stranger, visible minority. And this is going to be echoed, if I get the video, passionately by Fatou Diome. When she cites migrancy as an inevitable part of the globalized movement of African labor. Now, I work through critical black geography, and I look at how it allows us to theorize how race interlocks with notions of place and placelessness, with ideas around citizenship, and borders, right? Citizenship is sort of premised on the idea of borders. And as McCrittrick puts it, if who we see is tied up to where we see them, then the placement of subaltern bodies deceptively hardens spatial binaries, suggesting that some bodies belong, some bodies do not belong, and some bodies are out of place, right? And when we look at the media reports around European migrant crisis at the moment, Brexit moment, the discourse around the veil, the number of countries that are trying to start banning the burqa, right? We see how this depiction of like hordes of migrants attempting to cross the maritime borders, the Atlantic or the Mediterranean, hardens spatial binaries, right? In such a way that they reframe Europe's liquid maritime borders, the Mediterranean, etc., as fortress, right, solid, not porous, right, protective borders. Even though we know that historically these borders have been porous, particularly in the case of transatlantic slave trade. You know what, I am going to give up on the video. Okay, all right. So who is Fatou? The first clip was a YouTube clip by Cecile Emeke, who some of you might know from the Saltfish and Aki web series, right? Black British filmmaker. Now, she has a web series started in 2014 called Strolling. Strolling simply works on the basis of her going out into the street in different European cities, talking to black people and asking them, how does it feel? You know, to explain their life.
That's how it feels.
That's how it feels. So she starts in London. What happened? Is it the HDMI? For my computer. Don't worry about it. We've got 20 minutes. I think we'll talk through it. All right. So basically, Strolling takes, I think, the figure of the flaneur, right? Walter Benjamin, the person who's got the rights to the city, right? Who can walk through the city with a certain amount of freedom. And she uses that to then question how it feels, right? To what sort of rights do you have as a black person walking through the streets of various European cities? The clip I was going to show was from one called Flandre, the French version of it, in which two women talk about Fatou. What is Fatou in this context? Or who is Fatou in this context? They say, well, Fatou is like the Chanel maid. Fatou is the one where you walk into a party and you're not feeling that great about how you're dressed, and you think that everybody's looking at you. They're like, So they talk about this competition, all right, between black women, and the way in which they judge each other, right? And judge who's an insider, who's an outsider, who's got it, and who doesn't, right? So that's Fatou number one. Fatou number two. In a 2006 interview with Lauren Ekwe, a Franco-Togolese novelist and freelance fashion writer, who's written a book, a hip-hop novel called Economies, Urban Icon. She writes, she says, and I'm not going to read the French version, I'll read you the English translation, which is my translation. In my work, I wanted to present a French book with a black heroine who is strong and far from pathos. In the films, it's always Fatou, the Malian woman, genitally mutilated, raped, cliché. It's not the case of all black girls born in France. We're not all social welfare cases, right? That's Fatou 2 in literature. And then there's Fatou Diome, who really is named Fatou, okay? And Fatou Diome, the author of The Belly of the Atlantic. In 2015, this Franco-Senegalese author shocked French national television audiences by declaring that Europeans had better move out because she is here to stay. And she said, if you are going to sit here and you as like goldfish and you're behind your little fortress and think that some of us aren't going to come here, forget it. All right? Either you throw yourselves in the ocean, but just accept that we're here. Right? And this was during a televised program, right, on migrant crisis. But it was interesting because the program was called, what's it called now? Must we welcome all the misery of the world, right? And there are all these people going, African migrants, all this misery coming our way, whatever. And she was like, the world is global. A Senegalese person will work in New York. Somebody from China will work. Why do you think Europe's different? Okay? And that's that Fatou. And this is the Fatou that I'm interested in. The Fatou who I also need you to think through in terms of the other two Fatous that I spoke about, right? Now this Fatou Diome comes to France. How? She comes to France after marrying a Frenchman. She grew up in the island of Naidu in Senegal. Left home at the age of 13 to work in the nearby town, in a town of Mbour. At the end of her studies, meets a Frenchman, goes to France, migrates, gets married, and she gets there and the family totally reject her. And her own family has rejected her. So Fatou Diome started working as a housekeeper. She cleaned houses, she worked her way through the University of Strasbourg, got her PhD, and wrote this novel, The Belly of the Atlantic, right? And she's written others. She has written, and because I mixed up my order now, I've totally mixed up my order.
Maintenant, on est dans une situation où c'est ce que vous
That's
dites.
Fatou. Okay. All right, you guys are still, we'll see her. So Fatou wrote this, her work does work on this, always deals with migration between Africa and Europe. She has written, only 4 minutes. Guys, you're gonna have to give me time, I'm sorry, all right? Just a little bit. She wrote, her first book was called La Préférence Nationale, which was a collection of short stories in which she spoke about the French preference for whiteness. She's like, it's a national preference. Then she wrote Belly of the Atlantic, and has also written another book called Celle qui attend, which is a book about the women, right? Much like in the migrant labor system that we knew under apartheid, about the women who have to wait at home, right, in Senegal, while the men go and work in France. Right, so let me go into into the text then. So, Belly of the Atlantic, I'd say, can be read autobiographically. So I'm going to start speaking about Sally / Fatou. Because Sally is the heroine, the main character of Belly of the Atlantic. And the book starts with a dedication. In the dedication she says, and it's dedicated to her grandmother. And she says, "Now I imagine you finally at rest, taking tea with Mohammed and Simone de Beauvoir. I lay my wreath of words down here so that my freedom might be yours." Okay. Now, the reflexive gesture denoted by the last two lines, "I lay my wreath of words down here so that my freedom might be yours," is reflected towards the end of the novel. I'm not going to go through the novel in its entirety. When Sally, the heroine, reflects on her relationship with her grandmother and with feminism. It's quite a long quote, but for me it's a quote that is at the center of my analysis of the novel as a feminist text. It says, "For a long time, my smile meant I'm sorry. I expected my submission to earn me love, but in vain. So then I demanded respect. As a rebellious teenager, I decided to do only as I pleased, always with the support of my grandmother, a feminist in her own way. I stepped onto my boat and I turned my suitcases into vanishing cases. Exile is my geographic suicide. Leaving means having the courage to go and give birth to oneself. Being born to oneself is the most legitimate of births." Right? It's a rather long quotation. 1 minute more.
We have 5 minutes left in this session. I don't know if you want to take a little extra time, but then we maybe will go into the tea break to talk a little.
Yeah, all right. So, this rather long quotation informs my relation of Fatou Diome's feminism to the idea of being born of oneself, and to migrancy or self-imposed exile in Europe as geographic suicide, a sort of erasure of black subjects within this geographic space. Like Diome, Sally is depicted as a native of Naidu, eking out a living as a writer in France and cleaning houses. The representational doubling allows me to read the novel as autofiction, right? Sort of a hybrid form of autobiography and fiction. And this is highlighted through the depiction with the doubling of Diome's failed marriage and Sally's, where in the first chapter she reflects on what her fictional younger brother thinks of her life in France. And she says, "He'd seen me leave on the arm of a Frenchman after a lavish wedding, which gave no hint of the storms to come. But once in his country, my skin cast a shadow over this ideal. His family wanted only Snow White. It was no use telling Adichie that as a cleaning woman, my survival depended on the number of cloths I went through." So for Sally, for the geographical suicide or exile does not translate into a permanent departure from Senegal. Like most migrant laborers, she comes home with money and gifts, etc., right? All the while hiding.
He eventually is looking at me and sorry.
Okay. Yeah, just pause it. Hiding the financial strain, right, that this causes her, because that's what migrants do, right? They hide the juggling act that is behind their return home. And these return trips, though, mark her as exiled from near-door society. In the first trip, she realizes that as the migrant / bearer of gifts and money, she's now exempt from women's work. So she no longer has to cook, etc. People come and pay homage and sort of expect her to give them some sort of gift as she sits there in the living room, right? During her second visit, chapter 11, she saves a bit of money after visiting home to treat herself to a hotel in the town of Ngoa, where she, like Diome, had gone to school as a teenager. But when she gets to the hotel, she gets mistaken for a prostitute by the receptionist, right? So she arrives and the receptionist immediately says, oh, please go tell your client to pay in advance, you know? And so she takes out her passport and she starts to wave it under his nose and she's like, how dare you? And I'm trying to find it. She's basically saying, how dare you? Look, I've got a passport, right? I'm here on holiday. And she shows her French residency permit. And there's immediate change of attitude, right? He calls her a Frankibnabe, right? A person from France. And he says, apologies, madam. Welcome to our country, right? And she also has other, incidents in the road where outside this hotel, because she now dresses and looks a certain way, that people are asking her for money, telling her sob stories about, their uncle who died, and can she please give them money, etc. And then when she responds in the language, they go, oh my goodness, you're from here, right? So exile is not just about being in France. Exile is about the return as well, right? It's like a double exile. But what I wanted to say is these shifts in gender roles, in the stereotypes about economic power and financial independence, right, depict her as an African woman, as sort of the financial independence of African women, are key to this novel's reconstruction of Fatou as Afro-European. And this is imbricated, like I said, with the notion of geographic suicide, right? The silent racializations and the material lived experience of being black in Europe. And it's further elucidated through Mandike's financial demands on her. This is her younger brother. His absolute indifference to the difficulties of Sally's trajectory to France, the failed marriage, the working as a housekeeper, right? And this includes when she tells him of an incident of sexual abuse while she was a teenager in Mboa. And he still is more concerned with, well, you're living the better life, just give me the money, right? So in this forum, I will not have the time, and I definitely will not have the time, to unpack
one minute till 2.
Yeah, other representations of African womanhood in this novel, nor the novel's personification of the Atlantic, the oceanic liquid border between Senegal and France as a hungry belly, which I argue in the longer paper is the feminized belly through which Fatou/Sally gives birth to herself as both African and European, through this dialectic of unbelonging, right, in both spaces. It's a bit... Can you see? Yeah, one of you. We owe it to you. Okay.
Look, you can't help but think that she eventually is looking at me and sideways and like she's judging other people. Because that in black girls' head, when I was at school, I remember that they had this thing with the Fatou. Fatou is like Unigwe, like the Shinene, the girl that is really basic and written. That's also where the competition starts. Because you don't want people to think that you're a Fatou. So the other girl in the room, you have to show the other people that you are, more sophisticated than her. I mean, if I go out and I'm not dressed well, and there is another black girl coming in and she looks nice, I will automatically think that eventually she's looking at me sideways because I'm not on point. And it's too much pressure at the end of the day, of course. It's too much pressure, black.
Yeah, and then 2 or 3.
Plus jamais aucune autre, tant qu'il y aura des carences ailleurs dans le monde. On est dans une société de la mondialisation où un Indien gagne sa vie à Dakar, un Dakarois gagne sa vie à New York, un Gabonais gagne sa vie à Paris, que ça vous plaise ou non, c'est irréversible. Alors trouvons une solution collective ou bien déménager d'Europe parce que j'ai l'intention de rester.
Yeah.
I think we got through it. Thank you, everyone. I apologize for some technical difficulties and variations in pace, and also a late start. If people wouldn't mind hanging out for a little bit more and eating into some tea break time, maybe we could have a little bit of a collective discussion so that everyone gets some engagement with their work. Yeah.
So for the first paper, I really enjoyed the paper on consequential complicity. And I have just put you to the spot to say I think that Galton's work on structural violence will help nuance the notion of structure so that you're connecting structure and structural violence. Secondly, very quickly, I'm wondering if it wouldn't be important maybe to set Tlali's story, because it's exactly the same time as a reverse defender. That is the life story that Cullen argues is then taken up by women in Masiru, and it's so what she's writing in her story is actually a reverse migration story. So it's a feminist version of Defender, which is the traditional oral Sesotho storytelling, right? And then I just have a slight question about jouissance, because now this is going to sound weird, so everybody just bear with me here. But we always assume that the young woman is her first sexual assault, and I find that very bizarre why we do that, especially in South Africa. Right. So there's also this shame, and you folks were talking a lot about shame. When we interview young women, even down to 4 years of age, which I've done for 20 years, who are sexual assault survivors, one of their big shames, especially if they get assaulted or raped when they're around the age of puberty, is that when they think back to it, their body is still out of their control and goes into desire. Okay, now we might not like that story, or we might not want to call it desire. That's not my point, but I just think it's something to be thought about in terms of the ambiguity of what you see in Tlali at that moment. If that makes any sense. I know it sounds weird, but that's how it actually... Okay, thank you. Because a lot of people would come straight at me and say, well, the X, right? And then just to say, the piece about buying things and trying selves on as being superficial, who was talking with you? I'm just not sure it's superficiality. I really like the idea of trying things on. You know, that the idea that you try out a life before you live it doesn't seem to me to be that superficial of a thing to be doing. It's just a question I had. And then in terms of, I think the whole bit about silent racialization and amnesia is really crucially important. And then in terms of your piece, I just want to point out that there is in the rural areas, and I'm sure you know this, I would be a bit careful about the whole paying for assault in the rural areas, because it's actually now called idamage, right?
Paying for assault?
Yeah, paying. Okay, so when a young woman is naked and a man comes up to her, at least in KwaZulu-Natal, and remember the piece around She Owns Agency, there was a quote about it's no different than in the rural areas.
No.
Oh, that's what I'm talking about. I would be a little bit careful about taking it at its word. Yeah,
Okay.
because Idama, it used to be a different thing. It used to be you were fined because your daughter was valuable. Now it's turned into, as Archie Msomi, a social worker I worked with in Ikopo said, it's like the more money you have, the more you can rape. And there's kind of almost, in some families, a happiness when the daughter is assaulted because then they get money because they're so poor. So I would want to just contextualize that a little bit. From my rural experience of working. Yeah. I'm not saying everybody's like that, I'm just saying those are possibilities that I have worked.
Yes. Please.
I was wondering if between Sam and Amanda? Sam and Andrea, I'm kind of read things. And Ntokozo, if there was a conversation to be had about the different ways that you're using intersectionality, because it seems to imply a very different understanding of power between what you're doing. And I wondered also in terms of the way you're using agency, if it implies a subject, for example, an assumption that sexuality is property of the person. And I think there's a difference again between the way you're understanding sexuality, in which case there's an intimate division of labor and power, but also of division of inside and outside, right? By which a particular kind of liberal subject can have agency, or the speaking act or utterance becomes the action of agency, when in fact it seems to, and that seems to imply a particular kind of subject who I don't know if Tlali or Adichie are doing, because they're not working with that subject, right? So and I wondered if also related to how the word female, because for me female in terms of thinking of the migrant position conceptually, which I think is a part of exactly who is Fatou in terms of what you're doing, Polo, is that the female subject, if we're not thinking biologically deterministically, is a subject of, it's a migratory subject, and so the production of difference by which the female is not a biologically determined position, but actually as a constitutive relation, would imply a totally different understanding of what the Speech Act does, right?
Do we want to take maybe one more question and then respond?
Thank you. Sorry, I just want to point to Darlene Clark-Hines' work on cultures of dissemblance among Black women around sexuality, because of the ways in which, under conditions of systemic sexual violence, the negotiation of that constant violence sometimes includes forms of affective relations, and so I think that this, in other words, what does resistance look like? Does resistance always look like fighting back with a knife and screaming? And so I think that I'm wondering if one looks at a different lineage of the word complicity that includes these feminist engagements, we might arrive at a word that is not complicity. But, because I see that you are refusing this idea that women are responsible for their, a victim blaming discourse. I understand you're refusing that. But I wonder with this word complicity, it aligns subjects in ways that, I'm still not comfortable with, even with the word consequence. And I wondered therefore if, there's another, there's this other feminist description engagement.
Perhaps we can respond to those.
Yeah. I'm still going to come back to it. Okay, I'm not really sure what practice you're referring to, but the participants, the quote that I read off the participant, they were specifically talking about virginity testing, and the damages being the fact that the young girl has now lost her virginity. They didn't necessarily speak in terms of like the girl was raped or assaulted, so it could have been consensual. Exactly. So I wouldn't necessarily relate.
No, that's different. That would be a little bit different, but this would be a version of it. I'm not trying to suggest that she didn't get it right. I'm just saying that when you're speaking, it might be helpful to. It's just I'm a rural researcher, so I'm always looking for all of those incredible rural nuances around practice.
Okay, well, I would also like to take from my participants the embodied experience and take my criticism. And in terms of how I'm trying to use intersectionality, I'm hoping that I got it as close to Kimberly Crenshaw's conception. In terms of that, I was interested in the different social dimensions and how, or different kind of frequencies of vulnerabilities which some of the participants expressed in relation to cultural practices or through the law. But what I was most interested in is how in all of that they were actually able to subvert those forms of domination or oppression, and through feminism, and how they're able through feminism to actually gain back or assert their power. So that's what I was kind of going for.
folks want to respond to the intersectionality question, or
Sure.
the agency, complicity, other
Yes.
word?
Thank you very much for those thoughts. I think that's really helpful for us to think more through what we mean by agency, especially in relation to sexuality as opposed to intersex. I think both Adichie, speaking about the intersectionality and also the idea of femaleness as being something that is anyway not, it is migratory, as you say. I think that both Adichie and Tlali are very clear that femaleness is defined by the structures in which these characters are living. You know, that the femaleness is not a biological precondition, but that it's about how they experience being a woman in these social conditions, and so I think that that's really clear in both, that the authors are both really clear about that it's not something kind of given, that it's about, and that it's about these structural relationships is what's important in their stories. So as you know, as black women specifically. So I think and I don't know if you have anything else you want to say about agency.
Yeah. Thank you for all the comments and feedback. Very helpful. Thanks. However, I've also been troubled by the use of the term complicity, and that is why we take such pains to unpack. We haven't come up with something alternative. Perhaps this conference will help with that.
I think maybe what maybe is helpful about using complicity is because I think that in the texts, both authors evince a kind of uncomfortableness about their own characters' complicity. So that complicity with its slightly negative connotations is actually helpful in showing how the authors use the term, or not use the term, but use the concept. So that obviously, it's not about us making a judgment on the characters, but rather how the authors are presenting the characters, and how their attitude towards the characters is one of slight kind of transgression or.
I think that what you're picking up on is exactly what we experienced doing this work, and one of the aspects of the story is the discomfort. So the discomfort is ubiquitous there, the characters experience it, the authors are very much focused on it. We as readers feel it, you're picking up on it as a listener here. And it seems deliberate, and that is why we went with it. But I also hearing what you're saying, perhaps we can move beyond. So I take that.
Yeah, perhaps there's ways that we can theorize it beyond, even if there is a little bit of that idea of complicity in the stories. And thank you for that idea about us imagining that it might be the woman's first sexual assault, especially in Tlali, because I think that there are other stories that Moji writes about, like there's a story called Dua, in which she really shows how it's so common, and it's such a, so I think that is kind of important, but it's a strange thing in the story because the girl is presented as quite naive, for instance, in that conversation with the woman, with the older woman. So I don't know that it's in the story so much, but it is something that I think...
Yeah, in the context of Chinese border work.
In the context of your border work, I think we need to bear it in mind.
So I'm not sure about the culture of this conference, having not been here in the previous iteration. Theoretically, at this moment, at 4:15, we are launching the books of some of the people in this room. But I would notice that the people from the other side of the world haven't yet migrated here. So I also don't want people to feel like obligated to be here if you're tired. So one possibility is that we mill together and talk and drink tea with our lovely panelists and sort of ask questions in that forum. Yes? Thank you.